This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. On today's episode, I chat with a pastor from Bayside Church in Sacramento in California, Kevin Thompson. I asked him about the politically motivated pressure that may have influenced him to make a move away from his hometown church in Arkansas after 19 years of service, and the increasing role of the church in politics in the United States. We spoke about the assault on truth since 2015, Donald Trump, racism and gun control, as well as his work and his book, Fearless Families. Let's hear from Kevin. Kevin Thompson, a huge welcome to the Win Happy podcast. How are you keeping?
Yeah, Greg, thanks so much for having me. I look forward to our conversation.
And all the way from Sacramento, California, where you've assured me the weather is pretty hot at the moment.
It is. I mean, you would not want to be here. The sun is shining. All those things that a good Irishman would never want to see. But it is a little toasty here, so you're not nearly as jealous as you might be otherwise.
I had to go to my dermatologist. It sounds like I have one. I had to go there once, and he was just kind of telling me what my skin tone and everything. Yeah, just forget about the sun. It doesn't suit you. So maybe there's a reason why I live here and not in California. So I know you're a husband, a father, a writer, a blogger, and you're the married life pastor at, is it Bayside Church?
Correct. Bayside Church, yes.
Yeah, in Sacramento. And I know you've made a move recently. And the reason we're talking, I guess, and you're so kind, I listened to a Fresh Air podcast by the New York Times, and your name came up as part of the conversation. And I thought the subject matter was really, really interesting. So is it okay if I play a clip and then we'll kick the conversation off from there?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. I presume you've heard this, have you?
Yes.
Fair enough. So let's go.
You write about a pastor in Fort Smith, Arkansas, Kevin Thompson, who delivered a sermon in the fall of 2020, which would have been right in the middle of the Trump-Biden presidential race. What did he say in this sermon?
This is a pretty standard sermon that you'd hear in an evangelical church. It was about the gentleness of God. But he made one reference in the sermon that stood out to a couple of people in his congregation. So he was drawing this contrast between God as a loving and accessible figure, and just sort of comparing them to earthly celebrities as remote and inaccessible characters. And he just made a quick reference to, I think, Oprah, Jay-Z, and then Tom Hanks, just to sort of draw this contrast in an understandable way. And several congregants afterwards asked him by text message and phone call, what did he mean by that reference to Tom Hanks? And one of them raised the possibility, sort of suggested that he obviously didn't care about the issue of sex trafficking. He was completely confused by this at first, but sort of pieced together that they were being influenced by QAnon. A piece of the QAnon conspiracy theory is that Tom Hanks is part of this ring of Hollywood pedophiles. So it was, kind of a wake-up call for him, one of a couple of wake-up calls, that his congregation was really being influenced and listening to voices that he was having a hard time figuring out how to reach and how to respond to.
So before we go all in on that conversation, maybe a reaction to it, a question I ask my guests on the Win Happy podcast is, who the hell are you and where did you come from?
Yeah, so I grew up in Fort Smith, Arkansas, which is right in the middle of what many would call flyover country in America. It's right in the center of the heartland. Fort Smith is right on the border of Arkansas and the state of Oklahoma. And so grew up there, had a great upbringing, very conservative kind of place. So from an American politics standpoint, the first president I remember was Reagan. And I just assumed every president was like that. That everybody. I mean, remember. I mean, one of the first elections of my lifetime, Reagan is going to win 49 of 50 states and have one of the largest victories of all time. So I just kind of grew up thinking everybody loved their president, and this is the way it was, and that's kind of how it went about. Grew up in church, the evangelical church, of which I'm still a part and still believe. And so had a great childhood upbringing, all those things. Felt a call to ministry to work in the church life, and so I went to Oklahoma Baptist University for my undergrad, and then went to a graduate school in Alabama. And right after that, came back home to my hometown, to the church I kind of grew up in, and was a staff member there, teaching pastor. I'd preach about 50% of the time, and then eventually became its main leader, and that's where I've been for the last. So I was on staff the last 19 years, and then was the lead pastor for the previous 13.
And the evangelical church in Ireland, we have, it's very Catholic, and you also have a big Protestant community. My understanding is the evangelicals are like a more conservative version of the Protestant faith. Would that be correct?
That's correct. It's an aspect of the Protestant faith. So Protestant would be a larger umbrella. Evangelical would fall underneath that. You have mainline and then evangelical, at least here in America. And so, yes, evangelical would fall underneath that. Whenever you think about Billy Graham, it's going to be that line of faith.
And to us Irish folk, that's a bit confusing because we have our local church, and it wouldn't be all around the personality of the pastor or anything like that, or the priest. Actually, I've got a really, really good friend. He's a priest, Father John Ahern. And of course, the Catholic priests, they don't get married. And he was preparing for a wedding. And it was a very sad occasion because it was the wedding of my wife's niece. And quite recently, her father had passed away, and it was all very sudden. And it was very delicate because we knew everyone in the congregation was going to be very sad that Liam wasn't going to be there. So it was a happy occasion, but loaded with sorrow and grief and everything. So we had dinner the night before, and I was just asking him, how does he prepare for such an occasion? And he's trying to choose the subject matter and the right sermons or whatever to share with the congregation. And he was saying to me in a way that if it's a baptism or if it's a funeral or if it's a wedding, there's a very, very distinct audience. And it's always quite easy to decide on your script. But for a general mass, it's always difficult because it's such a cross-section of folk, all stages of life, all ages. So when you're picking your subject matter, it must be really difficult at times. And I can imagine when you're picking Oprah Winfrey or Tom Hanks, it's a wonderful way of earthing your conversation and making it very, very relevant. And when you talk about Tom Hanks, God almighty, talk about an icon. It sounds like the most sensible example to use. So when you were preparing that conversation with your congregation, like so many other ones, I presume you're doing it with, a good knowledge of who's in the audience and everything else.
Oh, you're very aware of who's there and what's going on, and I mean I'm in my hometown, and so a good number of these people I went to school with and grew up with, and then beyond that, having pastored there for 19 years, I had done their weddings and the funerals and the hospital visits, and so you do recognize it is a cross section of culture, but it's a cross section of just your culture and your small town kind of culture, and so you are very aware of the situations and circumstances that are in the room. And literally, I don't remember the specifics of this sermon, but my guess is Oprah, Jay-Z, and Tom Hanks probably wasn't even in the manuscript of preparation. Instead, it's just this basic idea of I'm riffing off at the moment to try to make an example to get this more real. And those are the names you come up with. And I mean, Tom Hanks is the everyman, in my opinion. I write in one of my books, I think it's in Fearless Families, in which I talk about Tom Hanks as an example of why are we so drawn to him. It's because all of us feel like he could be us or could be our dad or something like that. So I never imagined that example would get any response.
And that little bit of backlash as it was reported, did that blow you away? Did it floor you when you heard it?
Yeah, I think in isolation it wouldn't have been a big deal at all, and it really wasn't that harsh. So I faced far more criticism than that, and so it wasn't the criticism of that specific example as much as it was an eye-opening experience for me that I have good church members who are believing this. I think that's what scared me, because to me the idea that Hillary Clinton is running a sex trafficking thing out of a pizza place in New York is so far-fetched. Nobody's actually going to believe it. And the idea that Tom Hanks is a pedophile and all of that. And so when the first person texts me very kindly texts me and says, "Hey, help me understand," I was able to quickly explain it. And then when two or three other people came at it a little bit less kindly, then I began to realize I don't understand fully what's going on here. And here's the interesting thing, Greg. I love disagreement, and I take disagreement because I don't by any means think that I have the whole truth, that I have a monopoly on what's going on. I mean, as an evangelical, one of the things that I believe is that I'm a fallen person that lives in a fallen world, which means I can easily be deceived. And so I joke with people all the time, if you disagree with me, half of me disagrees with me too, because most opinions that I have are 51-49. And so we can find this common ground so easy. And even if we disagree, we can laugh about it and move on. And this was just a glimpse in the midst of a much larger picture that was going on nationally and even globally of we've got a problem here, because the moment we begin to lose the concept of truth, it's going to be a hard conversation to have.
Is that the first time you noticed that, in all of your years as a pastor, this very, very specific type of a problem?
I mean, I don't think it was the first moment I noticed it. Let's face it, this is an issue that goes back to late 2015. And as the political tensions begin to grow, this is when this became a serious problem. And even back into the birther movement with President Obama. And let me be very upfront. I mean, from a background and political perspective, President Obama and I would be on completely opposite ends of the spectrum politically. And yet the idea that he wasn't born in America or wasn't an American citizen, it was just racism. It is all it was, plain and simple. And the fact that so many of our people didn't see that for what it was scared me. We get into 2015, the chaos begins to take place. 2016 steps up. So by the time we get to this, that's when I recognized the problem was fully set in. So it wasn't the first example. It might have been the last example for me to recognize where we were.
But Barack Obama was a good man, and John McCain was a good man. You could see that, they had different views on things, but there was no badness. There was no moral emptiness or anything else in both of them. So it is really interesting. I'm going to play another clip, if that's okay, because it was another part of that conversation.
Okay.
He spoke against Trump there. He also, a few years later, he used the phrase Black Lives Matter there. And it was really the blog that got him in quite a bit of trouble from the church, because that was the place where they were realizing, our values aren't exactly in line here, and we're not comfortable with the direction that he's nudging us. As Kevin told me, he learned in seminary it only takes 7 people in a church to get you fired. So with this much sort of discontent roiling over racial issues, cultural issues, and then the pandemic laid on top of that, it's really an uncomfortable time to be an evangelical pastor.
And I know she mentioned your blog, and I've read your blog posts, and I think they're great. You were even taking on some red hot topics like abortion, which I know is the country divided again. And of course, that's up for grabs again with Roe versus Wade. And people have their views on it, but there's a big political agenda behind everything. It's huge. What's going on? And why is it an issue to take on something like Black Lives Matter and talk about that? It seems bizarre to me that any good living person, when they look at Trump, that they don't see him for who he is. The brilliant thing about him, there's nothing hidden. It's all out there, this horrible, empty character. Black Lives Matter and having an issue with race. I just don't understand it. I think for the most part, how we understand all of that agenda, and when we listen to the news and everything else over there, we just don't understand it. You obviously know the people in your town, people who attend your church every single Sunday or whatever. Why is commenting about race such a bad thing? Is something broken, Kevin?
I mean, you're asking an evangelical pastor if something is broken, and I would say yes, everything's broken to an extent,
okay.
including me. But I think there is. So racism is, and bigotry, all those things are naturally baked into who we are. We all have a proclivity toward those things. They just express themselves in different places and different cultures. But in America specifically, racism is such a backdrop of our national history and such a shame for so many people that it becomes a very difficult issue to deal with. And so one of the approaches in dealing with it is denial, which is a very human response to sorrow and pain. And so some just pretend like it happened, but it happened a long time ago and it's all over now, not taking into consideration their brothers and sisters and what they're going through. And so I think on all these issues, you have such a deep-seated cultural concept that's going on that I can only imagine looking on the outside into America. Many in the world have to be saying they've lost their minds. As that's assuming that you think we ever had our minds, which that could be debatable in and of itself. But you think about this within your own national history. There are things that I have no understanding of whatsoever. And so one of my bosses is from Ireland, and I will ask him on occasion, "Hey, help me understand. I don't understand Bloody Sunday. What's going on there, and how does that happen?" And it's really difficult for him to explain to somebody who has no background how these divides happen, and not just how they happen, but how they can be so passionate, so literal life and death. And so I think every culture has those things, and race is just one of the things within American history that we never have fully dealt with. And living in denial then forces the issue even more. And so people will look for anybody that's going to make them feel better, soothe their insecurities. Fear. All right. So my latest book, Fearless Families, it really is about fear. It's the concept of how fear drives us in ways that we don't even see. And I think all of these issues really come back to that we are afraid, and not knowing how to handle that, we turn to anything that promises that it will lessen our fears. And politically, both parties can play off of this and make the bad guy the other people. And it's not just that, hey, we disagree with them. It's that they are evil and they are what's wrong with our country, what's wrong with our world. And if we don't defeat them, then we are going to basically become more afraid. Our fear is going to become realized. And so I think all these things come back to those basic issues, which fear opens us up to deception very quickly.
We have a lot of family in the United States. I was telling you, my brother's there. My mom and dad lived there for 6 years, I think from 1958 to 1963. My mom's sister stayed there, and they have a family, and they're living out there and everything. And in Ireland, we've got this close bond with the United States anyway. And so the presidential elections we're as interested in the result of the election as anyone else. It gets huge publicity here. For someone in the United States, you might think that's crazy, but we are full on. I think the January 6th tribunals or hearings are happening today, isn't that right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, so we're so aware of all of that, it's amazing. The last presidential election, I was chatting to my mother and she said, "Oh, by the way, your uncle and aunt are voting for Trump." And I'm thinking, they're good people, and I know they are. What's a good person? But they're brought up well. They have a good family. They have a good, strong moral code. How they were voting for that man is just beyond me. I just don't understand it. I don't see how that's possible. Now, I do think part of the trick was all about abortion, and I think that was a big line in the sand. And it struck me a little bit when I was listening to them that they were being preached to every Sunday in church by the priests in their case, they're Catholics. And this was coming from the pulpit. And it was a strong line in the sand. I think they all knew Trump and what he represented, as we were saying. There's no secrets about that. But they were using that as a little bit of a trick, and it was being politicized. In Arkansas, would that be Trump country?
Oh, yeah. Oh, very much.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, it's one of the largest percentages of victory that he had. Oklahoma might have been more, but Arkansas would be one of the largest percentages of victory that he had. And what's interesting about that is, I mean, remember, we are not that far removed. Arkansas is the home of President Clinton, but that has very much become completely conservative. And I think here's the interesting thing for me. So in 2016, I would have no problem with anybody who voted for Trump. It's not even my business who they voted for, to be honest with you. But one thing that I wrote in 2016 is, hey, you have a very difficult choice here. So you have Hillary Clinton, you have Donald Trump. And so I wrote that for me personally, I could not vote for either one. And so I would find a third party candidate, knowing that third party candidate would have no option of winning. But one thing I said is, if you vote for either of the main candidates, I totally get it and have no problem with it. I think what struck me and what surprised me and what I wasn't ready for is, after President Trump won, the complete refusal of anybody like me and that I grew up with and my friends to criticize him or to say this isn't right. And so I understand you get into an election in 2016 and maybe this isn't the candidate you want, but hey, for our side, we're going to vote for him. But okay, then you have 4 years to get a better candidate. You have 4 years to get somebody who truly represents what for me growing up, it meant to be conservative. And yet, not only not willing to do that, but literally attacking me that by refusing to vote for him, I was promoting the downfall of our country and the moral decay that was going on. That to me was just ludicrous. And that's something that to this day I just don't understand. And I'm just grateful for those within the church who stood up against that and said this just isn't right. And there's a current evangelical pastor that I love greatly. His name is Andy Stanley out of Atlanta, and he just wrote a book called "Not in It to Win It," and it really lays out for me what is the biblical approach to politics in America. I obviously don't understand it in other places. But it's such a radically different approach than the way a majority of the American church have dealt with it over these last few years.
Like when your congregation head out the door every day, listening to the things that you're saying, and I presume there's a basic code about good living and good values and all of that kind of thing. How can they vote for him?
Yeah, and it really is a perception. What I heard constantly is we're voting for the platform, not the person. And that's fine. If somebody approaches it in that way, I mean, that's their business. I think that's one of probably the sad parts of where we are too, is how public personal politics have now become, to where people actually feel comfortable asking, who did you vote for? And it actually becomes a litmus test of whether or not we're going to be friends, of whether or not you can be my pastor, of what all those things. It's become so public. Whereas 30 years ago in America, the congregation would have been split of who they voted for, but nobody would have really known, because it really wouldn't have been a topic for public consumption. And I mean, that's one of the reasons I love Jesus, is he's more conservative and more liberal than any of us want. And so there are times that he would do things that would irritate all of us. And yet that concept of love and justice and truth all reside within him. And for some reason, many have lost that concept.
Yeah, I was chatting to some of my American friends trying to figure out this whole thing. And in an Irish context, if you think about the different political parties, not in a million years would you have a flag in your garden with the name of one of our politicians. Not in a million years. You wouldn't wear a baseball cap with the name of a politician on your hat. And people would have fairly strong beliefs about the different parties. But I know in the United States, you know, in your garden, you know, vote Trump or vote Biden and flags hanging off your Jeep and everything. It's more like your sports team. Now, if it's a conversation here about Liverpool Football Club versus Manchester United, then you'll see the rivalry and it's sport. And the thing that's funny, and maybe I can draw a comparison, is that when your team is doing badly, you might blame the players, or you might blame the manager, or you might blame the owner, but you always love your team. Is it a little bit like that?
Oh, I think that's a great analogy there, because think about this. Let's say your team has been losing for a while and they bring on a player or a coach that is everything you never wanted to be. You're against it all, but you start winning and you finally beat your opponent. Or, I mean, in American sports, it can happen this way. I don't know if it happens in soccer this way, but I'm sorry, I just call it soccer. But
that's perfect. Yeah.
The very concept of your main rival, its main player who you hate because they beat you every time, they come to your team. Well, now you absolutely love them. That is what's happened to American politics. That literally we care more about winning than we do about the actual principles. And I think that's one thing that maybe disillusioned me the most. I think what has happened to me is what Watergate was to my parents, 2016 was to me. So Watergate for my parents disillusioned them from government, from politics, and they realized they were being played in ways they didn't know. I grew up in the evangelical church being told character matters. I grew up in Arkansas being told Bill Clinton could not be president because he did not have the character that was required to be president. And that literally, if you voted for him, that was an immoral choice. And I believed that. And then 2016 came around. And when I lived out what I was taught, the very people who taught me that began to question my heart, because they were voting for a person that literally would have made Bill Clinton blush. And yet they had no hesitancy about it. And it really disillusioned me to the whole process, because I grew up believing that in the end, there were these core conservative principles that we believed in, with personal integrity being one. And what I found out in 2016 is those who had taught me that it was all a game. They didn't believe in those core principles. It was a political game. And if you could win it, you would win it. And that's all that mattered. And I really think that that's where we are from a concept of politics in America, even today.
There was a nice comment in that interview on the Fresh Air show that if 7 people decided, then you could be out of your parish. Is that what happened?
No, that's not what happened. I mean, so in the average church, it only takes about 7 people, not to maybe to make your life miserable enough that you'd want to leave. And so that's not what happened. The story from the story from the New York Times, it shows one slice of the pie of my experience in Arkansas, which was overwhelmingly good and positive and fun. We could have absolutely have stayed there and been happy for the rest of our lives. At the same time, there was enough of a minority that was making my life difficult enough that I just wondered, would it be better for these people if I left and a new voice came in, still saying the same thing I'd been saying, but not having maybe the history that had been there. And so I left of my own choosing. By no means was I forced out or anything like that. But there's no doubt that part of my leaving included this minority of people who would talk about me, but not to me, who would misrepresent what I believed and what I thought, and just made it difficult enough that when the right opportunity presented itself, suddenly I returned a phone call that I hadn't returned in 19 years and was suddenly open to moving, where I had thought I would live there for the rest of my life.
Okay. And of course, that's sort of a life. So in an Irish context, I was saying the priests have a single life, whereas in your case, you can enjoy a full life with family. I know you have a wife who works in advertising, I believe.
Correct. Yeah. So I have a wife. We've been married 22 years, and she owns an advertising company, which gives, let's face it, gives us more freedom.
Yeah.
because she has that salary. And I've always joked that the more money she makes, the more truthful my preaching became, because I wasn't now dependent upon that group of people for my finances. And then we have two children. I have a 16-year-old Ella. She has Down syndrome. And then a 14-year-old son named Silas. So yes, a typical kind of American family life.
Yeah, I should probably talk to your wife at some point because we work in the same industry. Well, we're marketing and PR.
Oh, yeah.
And by the way, one of our clients was Down Syndrome Ireland. So we're very, very close to Down syndrome and all the issues around that, from a learning point of view and everything. So
how great is that? That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Very, very special community. And so how was life for you? The big changes going to California?
A dramatic change. And we were really prepared for a dramatic change culturally. Growing up in Arkansas, you have this perception of California, of what it's like, and it feels like it's so different. But one thing I didn't realize is, again, how much diversity is even in a single state. And so where we came here politically looks like us. It doesn't have the cultural differences I really expected. And so we live in a much more kind of rural place outside of Sacramento, close to the city, and yet outside. I mean, literally, I'm driving into work this morning and there's a turkey crossing the street that I'm having to dodge to make sure I don't hit it. And so growing up, I didn't realize that existed in California. And it's been a great reminder to me that many of the preconceived notions that we have and many of the things that we're told about other people and other places simply are not true. They might be true about a segment, but it's not true about the whole. And one of the things that we need to do is to let go of the tags and the labels and the beliefs that we have about other people and actually get to know other people. Because I truly believe that what we have in common as humanity far outweighs anything that we have in differences. And you think about it, if we faced an existential threat right now from outside of our planet, this world would be unified. And yet, because we don't face that, we end up fighting against each other, which is a very sad state. I think about America post 9/11. This country was as unified as it could possibly be. And so it's almost as though humanity was meant to fight. And so we will either fight with one another or we will fight against one another. And where America is right now is we are fighting against one another.
Do we get a little bit careless so if there's that vacuum, where things are bobbing along quite nicely and there's no huge problems, so we end up making them?
No, absolutely. I think that's human nature. I really do.
And of course, close to home here, we've got Ukraine at the moment. So that's focus Europe. As a bit of a backdrop there, I think Putin, in terms of his timing with everything, I think he had a good friend in Trump. He could see that Biden is on a weak footing, it seems that way. He could see how the EU was potentially unraveling between Boris Johnson and everything else pulling away with the United Kingdom. So it was a great opportunity to strike, and he absolutely wasn't expecting Europe and the United Kingdom to come together, in the face of that sort of aggression and everything. He misjudged it 100%. So I think at times we do need that little bit of danger to get together. Do you think COVID had a part, the way we weren't interacting and we're all in our echo chambers? Like I notice myself with social media, when the algorithms get to work, instead of seeing diversity of news, you're seeing 100 of the same thing over and over.
Yes, COVID played a part. There's no question. But I think, no pun intended, I think COVID was a symptom of a greater problem. And I think you might have just hit on maybe what is going on across the board. And that is, we are now a couple decades into a world of technology, and we didn't understand the negative consequences of that, the dangers that are in that. And that literally, for the sake of power and profit, probably not even in that order, we have been played by social media, that literally it now feeds us whatever it is that we desire. You even go back into 2016 and you read through the Mueller report and you look at the ads out of Russia that were targeted, even on the phrase you used earlier, Black Lives Matter. that was used specifically by Russia as a way to create a divide in America, knowing what was there. And so I think it's very possible that a good amount of what we're seeing at this moment is the byproduct of this world of technology that we just it's so new, we just haven't figured it out. For instance, to use a metaphor, we haven't learned the need of a seatbelt. So the car has been created. People are dying in the crashes. We don't know what to do about it. And somebody comes along and creates the seatbelt, and that makes things safer. The same thing is true with social media. And I think we're just within the last couple of years starting to recognize there are great dangers here. How can we prevent algorithms from creating divisions within families? That really is where we are, I think.
Can I play another clip for you?
Absolutely.
I'm to the place right now, if you vote Democrat, I don't even want you around this church. You can get out. You can get out, you demon. You can get out, you baby butchering election thief. You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat in this nation. I don't care how mad that makes you. You get pissed off as you want to. You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat in this nation. They are God-denying demons that butcher babies and hate this nation. They hate this nation. Get mad all you want to. I don't care if you stand. I don't care if you throw tomatoes, praise God. I'm about to throw a microphone up in his house. CNN can eat my dirty socks. You cannot be a Democrat and a Christian. You cannot. Somebody say amen. Rest of you, get out. Get out. Get out in the name of Jesus. I ain't playing your stupid games. Bunch of devils.
So I believe that's a character that shares the same first name as me, Greg Locke. Have you come across that character? Have you heard that clip?
I haven't heard that specific clip. I've heard that specific name. It embarrasses me as a pastor to fall under the same title as that. I mean, contrast that with Jesus said to them, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn." I just don't hear any of Jesus in that. And no doubt Jesus flipped tables at the temple. I get it. But he did it against people who were powerful, who were abusing the poor and the weak. This just has nothing to do with Christianity. It has no Jesus in it whatsoever. And it really is taking the premise of Christianity and then just using it for personal gain and political preference. Here's something that's interesting to me in that moment. For me, as a pastor, it's my job to preach to the congregation that is before me that I live life with, which means that it's my job in many ways to make them see some weaknesses within them that maybe they don't recognize, to make them a little bit uncomfortable about some biases that they have. And yet notice what that person is doing in that clip. He is rousing the passions of the people before him by demonizing those who aren't even in the room. That is not what preaching is. That is not what the Bible is about. That's how the Bible has been misused by many. But that has nothing to do with Jesus. But the good news for me is this, that this aspect of life, of Christianity, of the church, goes back from the very beginning. If you read the New Testament, many of the letters in the New Testament, Paul will warn the church, beware of false teachers who basically tell you, who itch your ears, who tell you what you want to hear. And that to me is one of my great defenses of myself. If you go back and listen to my sermons back in Arkansas, was I preaching against those who were outside the room to the pleasures of those inside the room? Or was I encouraging those inside the room that we need to look at our own hearts and how fallen and sinful we are ourselves and give grace to those outside of the room? That for me is a grand difference.
It's just playing to the audience, isn't it? Big time. And if we're playing to the base, we're hearing all of the same language. And characters like that, is he doing well playing that game? Or have you any idea?
Oh, that game plays great. Because let's face it, you're going to grow an audience. You're going to grow power and influence. I mean, he's made a clip onto your show, right? Had he preached the gospel you would have never have heard of him. But the fact that he's taken this place, it leads to great personal well-being. And I mean, here's the question I would always ask myself: is this sermon I'm about to preach, is this article I'm about to write, will it gain me influence and power? Well, if so, then it's probably not the truth. And instead, if this will actually cause part of my audience to question me, if it will make them uncomfortable, well, I probably am telling them the truth. That's a difficult game to play, especially in this world of materialism and power. I mean, one thing that I write in Fearless Families is that fear causes us to lean on 4 specific, I call them idols. And it's the idea of safety, appearances, materialism, and power. And that love gives us 4 different things that we lean on. And it becomes the idea of trust, of heart, of relationship, and submission. And the truth of the matter is that what Greg Locke is doing in that moment is out of fear. He is making his congregation afraid and luring them toward the idols of materialism and power. And in so doing, he is profiting greatly for himself at the expense of the very people he's called to lead. By the way, that sounds like a politician, does it not?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He's playing to his base 100%. Now, and it seems to be working, and we're seeing a lot of divisiveness in the United States more than ever. Can you talk to me about Uvalde and how that is possible, and how the legislation that's just after passing the House is probably going to crash and burn in the Senate?
Yeah, that as a dad, so Sandy Hook happened at a time in which my children were of that age. And it's so unexplainable. And I get the idea we're always going to have people who are hopeless, who are suicidal, therefore homicidal, who are going to do things. I get that. But the complete unwillingness of American culture to in any way consider any measures that might restrain evil. You can never do away with evil, but it's the job of government. I mean, in my opinion, it's the God-ordained job of government to try to restrict evil as much as it can, knowing that we can never fully do away with it. And so it's a horrible question to ask, but literally the question becomes, if we're going to live in a world where things like this happen, how can you make it to where only one person dies instead of 19? And yet the complete unwillingness, it just shows how our politics have become the ultimate God at the expense of our humanity.
Yeah, and we hear all of the terrible, sad stories. Are we not moved to change the most basic common sense things? It's crazy. There's a traffic light, and when it's red, you don't go through it. That makes a lot of sense. Now, you might make a big argument that that's interfering with my freedom. I'm a free person. I'm going to drive through those lights if I want to. Well, that's not very clever. A lot of people are going to die if you don't stop at red. It makes a lot of sense to, not give 18-year-olds guns, and it makes a lot of sense to do background checks just to make sure that people have their wits about them and they're good, sane people, and they're going to manage their gun in a responsible way. All of that sounds really sensible, just like the traffic light. I just don't understand. I really don't understand.
There's a lot of issues at play, no question. And just the idea of what's going on in America right now with young men is very similar to what's going on in the Middle East with young men. And that is, if you can get a group of young men who are directionless and hopeless, you can get them to do a great deal of damage. And so for me, and this is an oversimplification, Greg, and so please, I hope your listeners recognize this. But literally for me, one of the fastest ways we can begin to eat away at this problem is with less guns and more dads. Because if you look at even in American culture, I read this the other day, that the easiest way to understand what an 18-year-old with a gun is going to do with it is his relationship with his father. And so if he has a close relationship with his dad, he's probably going to use that gun for hunting, for sport, for something like that. And so for me personally, there's no question that we need to do some very basic, the idea of background checks, of raising the age limits, of limiting the way you can get some of these semi-automatic kind of weapons, military style weapons. And I come from rural country where, you know what, you probably do need an AR-15 to kill the wild hogs that are out there. And so from a farming perspective, I do think there are places. And so let's guard that and make that happen. But this idea of the proliferation of guns and then the absence of fathers, if you look at all these shooters, one of the common elements that you will see is most of them do not have a relationship with their dad. And it leads to a hopelessness for 18-year-old, 19-year-old boys that lead to tremendous danger. So I just keep on saying, and this is not a very popular comment, by the way, among my crowd, I keep on saying less guns, more dads.
Have you been to Ireland?
I have not. We ironically, so Jenny and I were going to celebrate our 20th anniversary in Ireland. We were in the process of booking tickets. Our anniversary was June of 2020. And so we were in the process. And even when COVID first hit, the prices dropped so dramatically that we almost booked tickets. Obviously, we wouldn't have been able to travel, but we have not. But what's interesting here is where I'm at here in California now. One of our lead pastors is from Ireland, and we are looking at bringing a group of couples over and doing kind of a bucket list trip. So one of the things I do here, I'm the married life pastor, so I help with marriages. And so the concept is, hey, you and your spouse, let's do a bucket list trip to Ireland, and it will not only be exciting and fun, but it will help your marriage. And so we're hoping to come over within the next year.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I can ask you that question is I don't have a gun and I wouldn't be able to get one. I don't know of anyone who has a gun. The police that will look after our town don't have guns. No policeman walking a street in Ireland has a gun. Now, there's a special force, who are really chasing after the bad guys. They're a kind of an armed unit. You won't see them. You will not see a gun on a street anywhere. The army, if you see the army out and about, depending on what job they're doing, they will have guns, if they're doing some security on a run. You will not see guns anywhere. If I walk into Leinster House, which is our capital building, you won't see a gun. Now, probably one or two hanging around somewhere, by the security people or whatever, but you won't see them. They're not part of life. Yeah, and we've got bad people, of course we have, but you just keep things like that away from them, and society doesn't stop because you don't have guns. It really doesn't. It was never part of the culture here, and I don't know. So it just sounds to me like something that, obviously there's a lot of history, and it becomes part of your culture. And you said the dad and the son and hunting and all that kind of thing. We might go fishing. I suppose the nature of the countryside and everything, that there's different dynamics around all that.
It really is also a struggle of how do you unwind it. There are more guns in America than there are people. And so change the laws tomorrow. How long is it going to take to unwind the culture that we have created? I grew up not around guns at all. I've never had one. I've shot some just through friends taking me to ranges. They've always kind of scared me. But my wife's family, rural Oklahoma, you had to have it really for protection, even from wildlife. And so it was just part of the culture. But the idea of a shooting for them is just as much shocking and anathema, because their thought is you lock your gun up properly, you train properly. So it's more than just a gun issue, but at the same time, it is definitely a gun issue.
Yeah. Do you have a gun at home?
No.
Yeah, and I guess the argument then becomes, well, the person, potentially breaking into your house could be armed, so then you need to arm up, and it just goes on and goes on and goes on at that rate. So,
but it comes back. Think about this, Greg. It comes back to that concept of fear.
Yeah,
And
of course.
literally, are we making the choice out of fear? And no doubt, there are reasonable concerns. And I have no problem with anybody here that has a gun legally. I have no problem with that. I personally choose not to. And maybe part of that is because I understand even the suicide rate. And if you have a gun and a person is suicidal, they are successful. If a gun is not available, they often are not successful. And then they go on and live productive lives as they have a wake up call. And so for me, it's just, I don't know. I personally don't understand it. And that's one way you probably look at my country and go, what are you thinking? And I go, I know. What are we thinking?
Yeah. Yeah. On what planet do you allow an 18-year-old to have a gun? So you're on the Win Happy podcast. What's happiness to you?
You know, happiness to me is the byproduct of a life well lived. And happiness, I don't think it's something that we choose by any means. You know, I actually wrote a book entitled Happily. And so
I didn't know
it
that.
it is a use of the words of Jesus in the Beatitudes that I just read a couple of them to you a while ago. Jesus lays out, hey, here's who is happy in God's kingdom. It's the poor in spirit. It's those who mourn. It's those who recognize their need and then turn it over to Jesus. And the word blessed that he uses there, some translations translate happily. And so I just took that and applied that to marriage. That if you will take the Beatitudes, these 8 things that Jesus kind of talks about, and apply them to your marriage, you will have a happy marriage. And so to me, happiness is not something we pursue. It's a byproduct that we get from the concept of character, from the concept of loving each other well, from the concept of not living out our fear and instead choosing the way of feel fear, yes, but now choose the way of love in every aspect. And I think if you can do that, the byproduct of that is the sense of contentment, of well-being, of joy. And yet I think if you pursue after happiness, and that is your main pursuit, I think it becomes like a treadmill that you never fully experience it, because you tend to pursue after it through money, through power, through these things that just are never going to produce what they promise.
Okay. I like that definition. There's a winning as well. I always put the two of them together, and that's why I had Win Happy. So for me, you might love playing football, but if there were no goalposts, it might become a little bit boring or pointless after a while. So for you in your life and your goals and everything else, what does winning look like?
Winning for me means loving my wife well. It means being fully present for my kids to the best of my ability and giving them a climate in which they grow up knowing their dad loves them and supports them and is for them in every way. Winning to me is every day growing in some way and recognizing my own weakness and understanding and being a different person tomorrow than I was today, all in gratitude for what God has done for me in this life that he's given to me, and recognizing that I deserve none of it. And so to live my life in response to him with gratitude, that to me is success, and that to me is winning.
I've one last question for you, and it's a whopper. Are you ready for it?
Okay.
What was your best day?
You know, I think my best day, it's my 10th anniversary. For those first 10 years, I'd saved up quietly. Every time I'd done a wedding or a funeral, people would tend to give you $100 for giving your time. And I put all that money in a drawer. And I told Jenny, for our 10th anniversary, I'm going to take you to Hawaii. It's already paid for because of all this money I'd saved. And we went to Kauai, which is this kind of uninhibited island that a whole side of it you can't really even get to except by boat. And so we were out on the water on this little cruise. There's rainbows everywhere. You see the mountains and the water and the beach. I'm just there with my wife, and I know my kids are perfectly happy at grandma's house, completely content, probably happier that I'm not there than if I were there, because they're not being told no in any way. And Jenny and I are just there on that boat, and I recognize that here I have been with this woman for 10 years, and I love her more now than I ever have. And here we are 12 years later, and I love her even more now. And in that moment, I think there's just this tremendous sense of, man, I don't deserve this. Thank you. I think any day that you can say thank you is probably a good day.
That sounded like a pretty perfect day. Kevin, thank you so much for entertaining me, for accepting my invitation, this email out of the blue from, someone from the other part of the world, for being so generous with your time. I think my life would be a little bit better as well for our conversation. You are an absolute rock star, not like that other character, Greg Locke. But I'm sure you're making a big difference to a lot of people. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Yeah, you're one of the good guys. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Greg. It's been a great honor. And maybe we can end this by saying we need more Kevins and less Gregs. I don't know.
It's probably true. And when you do get over to Ireland with that group, yeah, there's a pint of, well, I could say Guinness, and that's what you might be expecting. But in the town where I'm from, the local stout is Murphy's or Beamish. So, yeah, I'll leave it up to you. A pint of Murphy's or Beamish. There's one or two of those with your name on it.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Good man yourself. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.